This morning, we're going to carry on looking at some Psalms, which we're doing over the summer, and we're going to look at Psalm 64 this morning. So I'm going to read those verses in just a minute. But I wonder if you've ever felt the way that David felt in this psalm. I wonder if you've ever felt betrayed, or if you've ever felt really let down, or almost conspired against. And for David, we're going to read that feeling was kind of overwhelming. It was the only thing that he could think about. And I don't know about you, but I've definitely been there when there's been somebody betray me or out to get me or whatever, and it's all that occupies my mind. And we're going to read this psalm by David where he starts off in that place. But we're going to see that where he comes to at the end is a place of wanting not just himself, but wanting all followers of Jesus to be rejoicing in God. So we're going to follow through his journey and understand when we find ourselves in that place, when we feel overwhelmed by a sense of somebody betraying us or ganging up on us, how we can deal with that and stop it being the only thing that we can see so that we can look beyond ourselves to rejoicing in God. So let's read Psalm 64 together. It'll come up behind me. Hear me, my God, as I voice my complaint. Protect my life from the threat of the enemy. Hide me from the conspiracy of the wicked, from the plots of evildoers. They sharpen their tongues like swords and aim cruel words like deadly arrows. They shoot from ambush at the innocent. They shoot suddenly without fear. They encourage each other in evil plans. They talk about hiding their snares. They say, "Who will see it?" They plot injustice and say, "We have devised a perfect plan. Surely the human mind and heart are cunning." But God will shoot them with his arrows. They will suddenly be struck down. He will turn their own tongues against them and bring them to ruin. And all who see them will shake their heads in scorn. All people will fear. They will proclaim the works of God and ponder what he has done. The righteous will rejoice in the Lord and take refuge in him. All the upright in heart will glory in him. Okay. Now, I wonder, when you hear the name David, who wrote this psalm, what's the first story you think of? I heard some voices up there. Shout a bit louder for me. Goliath. Yes, David and Goliath. That's the first story we think of, isn't it? Let's juggle the pointer and then get a little picture, an artist's impression there of David and Goliath. Now, probably most of you know the story. Goliath is from the enemy of God's people, Israel. He's a Philistine, and he comes out and he challenges all the Israelite army to fight him one-on-one to decide who wins the battle. And the entire Israelite army are terrified because there's this 9-foot giant guy who is a hardened soldier. And I kind of understand how they feel. I think I'd be pretty terrified too. But not David. David, who's probably a teenager, just a boy, comes along and says, "I'll take him." And has this faith to go and fight this giant because he believes that God will fight for him. And a 9-foot giant compared to me would look pretty scary, but a 9-foot giant compared to God is not very scary. And so David has the faith to go and fight this giant. Now, what a lot of us will know, but isn't quite such a well-known story, is that after this, David suddenly, he rises to prominence in the nation of Israel. And there's a king at the time called King Saul. And to begin with, he quite likes David because he went and sort of saved their skin. And he starts promoting David through the ranks of the army. And David goes and does all these battles and wins them all. And he becomes really celebrated in Israel to the point that King Saul suddenly becomes very envious. And King Saul is suddenly very worried that David is going to take his throne from him. And David doesn't know any of this. And in fact, David thinks King Saul really likes him because he keeps on promoting him. He even gives him his daughter as a wife, so he becomes the king's son-in-law. And then one day, 2 of King Saul's children confide in David and tell him that the king is out to get him, his wife, and also King Saul's son, Jonathan. And David goes on the run. First of all, he goes on the run to a prophet called Samuel, which seems like quite a good place to go on the run. But immediately after that, he goes into this kind of panic, this sort of blind panic, this fear of Saul being out to get him. And do you know where he runs to? He runs to the land of the Philistines. So he goes to the very place, the enemy of God's people, the people that he's been killing in battles. And he doesn't just go to the land of Philistia, but he goes to a particular town there called Gath. Anyone know who came from Gath? Goliath. That's right. And so, what do you think his welcome was going to be there? Think he was going to be in any less danger? And to top it off, do you know what he took with him? Anyone remember? Goliath's sword. That's right. So not only did he go to the very city of his enemy, the city where he'd not that long ago killed this great Philistine champion, but he went there holding the guy's sword. Okay, and you can kind of see that he'd gone into this panic mode, this fear, and fear had taken control of him. And instead of talking to God, instead of looking for a more sensible refuge, he ran off to the one place where he was probably in more danger than if he'd have stayed there where Saul was trying to get him. And so when we read this psalm, it actually begins by seeing a bit of a way in which David had grown in his faith. Because let's look at what he asks for in the first two verses. So the first thing he says is, "Hear me, my God, as I voice my complaint." And what he's basically saying is he's taking his legal appeal to the judge of all the earth. So instead of running away, he's talking to God. And then the next thing he asks for, the first thing that he asks God to do, is protect my life from the threat of the enemy. And that word threat, it actually means fear or terror. So what he's saying is, I don't want to do what I did last time. I don't want to be overwhelmed by panic and go and do something stupid, like go to Gath with Goliath's sword. I want to be protected from reacting in fear and panic. So we can kind of see some growth in David in this psalm. And then the third thing that he asks for is to be hidden. Hide me from the conspiracy of the wicked, from the plots of evildoers. So we see David that although he has grown and matured, he still understands that even though he's older and wiser, he still needs God to be the one to hide him. And so this is the stage that we find David in. Now, I wonder what it was that scared David. Now, I don't know about you, but like I said, if there was a 9-foot giant, hardened soldier who wanted to fight me, I'd be pretty scared by that. But not David. David wasn't scared by that. So what could be so bad that it could possibly scare a man like David? Let's have a look at verse 3 and find out what it was. They sharpen their tongues like swords, and aim cruel words like deadly arrows. So what was the main weapon of David's enemies? Anybody? What was it they were using as their weapon to tear David down? Words. Thank you. You have to shout louder for me to hear you. I'm getting older. Oops. Keep on pressing it the wrong way. There we go. Words are really powerful, aren't they? We know it, don't we? Think of words that can change your life. Some for the better, some for the worse. Words like, I love you. That can change your life, can't it? Words like, you're fired. That can change your life, can't it? Words like, you'll never make anything of yourself. That can set the direction of your life, can't it? Words like, well done, you've passed. You've qualified. That can change your life, can't it? Words are really powerful, aren't they? Words are powerful enough that a man as brave as David was saying to God that he was in danger of being terrified by them. So terrified that he could end up panicking or running off in terror like he did when Saul was after him. And what that means for us is that we need to be very careful with our words, don't we? Words are very powerful. We need to remember that. And there's not just words, but there's an arrogance to David's enemies as we follow it through. They shoot from ambush at the innocent, so it's very different from Goliath, who stands there and says, "Come and fight me." These people are hidden away, and they're shooting at David where he can't see them. And they shoot suddenly without fear. You notice that? Without fear, there's a real arrogance to the way that they're behaving. And it goes on. They encourage each other in evil plans. They talk openly about their plans. They talk about hiding their snares, and they say, "Who will see it?" And then this verse 6, they plot injustice and say, "We have devised a perfect plan. Surely the human mind and heart are cunning." And this word that's translated cunning is quite difficult to really translate and get the meaning of, but it kind of means sort of mysteriously deep, okay? And it really embodies the utter arrogance of these enemies of David, these wicked, these evil. What they're really saying is that the heart is so well hidden beneath everything on the surface that no one will find out. It's a bit like them saying that they could maybe be David's best friend and yet be the one that's out to get him, because David will never know that it's me. It's this sort of arrogance that I'm not going to get found out. And of course, we know that's not true. We're going to find out about that in a couple of minutes. But before we move on to the next verses, I just want to apply those to us briefly, applying kind of as we go. And I said right at the beginning that I'm sure that most of us in here will feel like we've been in David's position before. Like we've had this sense of there's someone out to get us, and it's such a kind of overwhelming thing that it's the only thing that we can think of. We felt betrayed or let down. It could be by a friend, a family member, or a work colleague that's out to get us, or just someone online maybe that's don't even know who they are that's out to get you. It could be any of those things, but we've probably all felt that way, where it's so overwhelming that it's the only thing we can think about. But also what I want to challenge you with is that we've also all been the enemy. I know that I've been the person who has caused this sort of pain. I know that I've been the person who, maybe in a different context, maybe it's not been causing pain to another person, but I've been the person who thinks I've done something that nobody's seen, and of course I'm going to get away with it. And I know I've been that person, and I'm afraid to tell you, you've all been that person too. And the reality is, if I hadn't been that person, I wouldn't need Jesus. I'm here in a church because I've been that person. I sometimes am that person, and I need Jesus. That's why I'm here. And for all of us, if we want Jesus' help, we have to recognize that we are sometimes in David's situation, and we're sometimes David's enemies. Okay, but there will be good news, but I'm coming to that soon. Okay, so let's carry on. What does David do? Okay, so David, he's in this place where he's just overwhelmed. It's the only thing he can think about. And he spent the first 6 verses, over half this psalm, telling us all about this. Okay, it's the only thing he can think about. What does he do? He looks to and expects a good judge. Verse 7 is a real contrast to verse 6. It ends with these people arrogantly saying, the human heart is so deeply mysterious that no one's going to find us out. And of course that isn't true, because God sees everything, doesn't he? But what David then says is that he is expecting. So notice this isn't David saying this is what God did. This is David saying this is what I expect God to do. He's expecting the judge that he's appealing to with his complaint to act not just justly, but to act with a kind of perfectly fitting justice for the crime. Let's just read through it and see how it really mirrors and fits perfectly with what God's enemies have been doing. So, they've said, surely the human mind and heart are cunning or deeply mysterious. What was their main weapon? They aim cruel words like deadly arrows. That was verse 3. Verse 7, but God will shoot them with his arrows. You see? They're shooting arrows. God will shoot them with his arrows. It's a fitting crime, a fitting punishment for the crime. they will suddenly be struck down. What was their weapon that was compared to an arrow? It was they sharpened their tongues like swords and cruel words like deadly arrows. There's lots and lots of them talking in verse 5 and saying in verses 5 and 6. Verse 8, he will turn their own tongue against them and bring them to ruin. They were using words, God will use their own words against them. It's a fitting punishment for the crime. And then last but not least, they were saying, who will see it? In verse 5, and they have this idea that no one will find out. All who see them will shake their heads in scorn. It's a fitting punishment for the crime. They think they can do it with no one seeing and that they'll get away with it. And quite the opposite. It seems like many people will see it and shake their heads in scorn. Now, in some ways, that's actually bad news for us, isn't it? Because do you remember, as I was sort of applying as we go, it's good news on the one front in that we all identify with how David's feeling, don't we? We've all been the kind of victim in this situation. And so it's good news that we can expect God to give a just judgment. But the problem area is that we've all also been like David's enemies. And so it's very bad news if I get a fitting punishment for my crime, isn't it? Let's come back to applying as we go. What's really amazing is that David here, he's expecting perfect justice, and not just perfect justice, but fitting and caring justice for the world. We've already seen a better and even more caring and even more perfect justice for our world. If you've ever been to church before and you've heard about what Jesus did, then you have heard about this. So we have heard about a man called Jesus who came and did nothing wrong and died on the cross and took the punishment that I deserve upon himself so that justice could be done and yet I could be forgiven. And do you understand that's the action of a God who is perfectly just, who has a punishment that fits the crime, but also cares about the people that are stood before him in his courtroom, cares about the people of his creation. That is the perfect and righteous judgment of a good judge. And isn't it striking to think that when Jesus was on that cross, he experienced just what David did here. People would walk past and mock him with the belief that this couldn't possibly come back on them. They could make fun of this guy on the cross, and how would it ever come back on them? I mean, he's on the cross, what can he do? How would it ever backfire on them? And yet, God saw it, didn't he? But the amazing thing is that Jesus, in David's position, not only looked to a good and just God, but actually took that punishment himself. And it's striking too, as I said earlier, that we've all been in David's enemy's shoes, that we also need to recognize that that day when Jesus hung on the cross and people walked past and mocked him, if I'd have been there, I'd have been one of those people mocking him. And I want to challenge you that if you'd have been there, you probably would have been too. So, where does it leave us though? So David, having come from this place of being overwhelmed by what's going on around him, by these conspiracies, these people that are using words unkindly, when he then looks and expects the good, caring and perfect and fitting justice of God, he's then able to look beyond that. And he's then able to look for something better. And that brings us to verse 9 where he says, all people will fear. So do you notice a big contrast there? David's been talking all about himself, hasn't he? And now he comes on to all people. So he's gone from just himself to everyone. And what will all people do? They'll fear. Or rather, they'll kind of be in awe of God and in awe of his actions. And they're going to proclaim, they're not just going to talk about God's judgment, but they're actually going to proclaim, they're going to go and tell people. You know, do you understand the difference between just chatting about it rather than sort of saying, oh wow, did you see what God did? It's actually going and telling people, to making a point of, I'm going to go and tell that guy over there. So all people will proclaim, and then they'll ponder what he has done. So that word ponder, it means kind of wisely consider. In other words, what they'll do is they'll say, you know what happened to these enemies of David? I don't want that to happen to me, so I'm not going to do anything stupid like that. So there's almost a growing of God's kingdom in the world from seeing his perfect and righteous judgments. I don't know whether you notice. Do you remember what our vision is at Harbour Church? Could anybody summarize the two kind of key points of our vision as a church? Can you remember? Andy and Tim aren't allowed to because they preached on it. Refuge, very good. And what was the other one? Reaching out. Okay, so we've got, in verse 10, we've got this sort of a reaching out will happen, haven't we? That they'll be reaching out. Let's see what happens in verse 12. So now he goes from talking about all people to talking about the righteous. So by that he means people who trust in God, people who trust in Jesus. What will they do? They'll rejoice in the Lord and take refuge in him. So again, the other part of our vision at Harbour Church, what we want to see happen. People take refuge in God, and so God's people, the followers of Jesus, to take refuge in him, and then to reach out, to tell people what God's done, to tell people about the gospel, about God's perfect and loving and caring justice. So the righteous will rejoice in the Lord and take refuge in him. All the upright in heart will glory in him. If you want to understand what it means to glory in something, just watch football fans at the end of a match that they've won. They haven't won it, have they? But yeah, they dance around and throw beer and slap each other on the back as if they were running around on the pitch for 120 minutes or whatever it was. That's what it is to glory in. And notice that they're all in the Lord, in him. And so David, he's gone from this place of having been unable to think about anything but his own circumstances, to being able instead to say, I want to see God's kingdom come. I want to see people taking refuge, rejoicing, glorying in God, and I want to see the world being transformed. And if that's what we want to do, if that's what we want to see, then we want to do the same. I'm just going to ask the band if they can come down and just start getting set up, because I'm going to ask you now what I'd like you to do. So I've been trying to apply a bit as we go. Do you remember that I said that we can identify with David, but we also have to admit to being able to identify with David's enemies? But just like David, who expected to see a judgment, we've had something even better. We've already seen a good and perfect and better justice that is even good for the enemy. It's even good for the one that betrays. And David was able to expect this justice, and it led him to then expect God to bring his kingdom in the life of his followers and in the life of those outside. And so what I'm going to ask us to do for a little while is I really want us to get to the point where we too can expect to see the vision of Harbour Church happen. That's what I want. I don't want us just to go away from meeting together as a church and think, hey, that sounds like a nice vision. Wouldn't it be lovely if that happened? I want us to actually go away and be praying and acting like we believe it will happen. And the way David got to that was that he spent time reflecting on God's goodness, his justice, his care for the world. So what I'd actually like you to do is just take a couple of minutes, and maybe while we sing this first song, just try to remember those things about God. Remember what Jesus did on the cross. Remember maybe how God has stepped in personal circumstances sometimes for you. I want you to remember back to what God is like, and then remember what he's done, and from that, remember what he's like. I'm going to ask Pete and the team if they will lead us in worship, and then I'm going to pop back up after the first song. But so spend a bit of time. The song will help us in that, reflecting on what Jesus has done and what he's like.